Hey everyone, my name is Nick Semrad, and I'm going to talk to you today about how an LFO works on a synth and some common ways that you can play around with changing the filter via a LFO to give you some cool synthy sounds. Part of the magic of a synth is that there are built-in ways to be able to modulate it or have it be modulated by something other than you, essentially. So one of the first things that I dove into on synths, and I think one of the most powerful ways to automate anything, but in this specific situation, the cutoff knob, is by using an LFO. So what LFO means is it's a low frequency oscillator. And what an oscillator is doing in this case is it's essentially sending some sort of like change to a parameter, right? We're sending voltage in old synths, but on here it's digital. We're changing something by oscillating it. And there's different ways to oscillate something. The most common one you're going to think of is just by turning it back and forth. Like if I'm going to use the mod wheel to do this, but I'm going to show you how to do it as an LFO here in a second. If I just play a note and kind of oscillate up and down, that's essentially oscillating the cutoff knob. We can actually do it in a more efficient way than by changing the mod wheel ourselves. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn up the LFO control on the cutoff. And what this is doing is it's essentially telling us how much this knob is going to be affected by an LFO. So if I turn it all the way up, the amount is going to be the highest. Like it's going to change it as much as it possibly can, right? So let's just turn, I'm going to have this knob down here, this setting down here is LFO frequency. And with LFOs, you're always going to have two things you have to measure in addition to the shape. We'll talk about shape in a second, but the main two things you're going to have to change are the amount that it's modulating and then the frequency by which it's doing it. So it's like, how much is it changing it? How fast is it changing it, right? So I'm going to turn the frequency up just so it's kind of at like a sane amount. You can actually kind of hear how, if I have this slow, that cutoff is opening and then closing, opening and then closing. And the cool thing about an LFO doing it, again, we're talking about automation. We're talking about having something else do the job for us, essentially. So I can play and I don't have to worry about trying to like modulate the cutoff myself. So an LFO, again, is in this case, it's affecting the cutoff and it's just opening it up and closing it, right? And if I start turning the amount down, again, we have amount all the way up. So it's opening it as far as it can go, closing it as far as it can go. If I turn the amount down, check out what happens. It's just not opening it up as much. And the cool thing about LFOs is there's like a starting point, right? Like I had the cutoff all the way down, so it can kind of only open and close. There's no, it doesn't really have that much room to go. But if I put the cutoff in the middle, now you have this situation where, if I turn the LFO off, you still have a pretty solid amount of sound happening, right? So the LFO is just going to add like a little bit of opening to that already fairly open sound. And in this case, we have a pretty slow frequency. You can hear it's super subtle. It's like, it's not intense, but if I turn the frequency up, these kind of like fast speeds can actually give you an interesting tone as well. And even quicker, you can still hear each opening and closing. Check out what happens as I really speed it up. So that's the basics of what an LFO would do to something. As you go deeper into Soundpaint, there are opportunities to use an LFO to alter other things. A real common one that I like to mess around with is altering pitch. And now I'm not going to set the LFO up, but you can kind of see how if I play a note, I'm going to turn this cutoff LFO up. If I like move the M pitch around, you're getting that kind of like warbly sound. So pitch can be a really interesting one. Pitch on a grander scale ends up being vibrato. Like when you hear someone sing in vibrato, what's happening is they're modulating pitch, pretty intensely. Again, the LFO at its nature, the only thing it's changing is just whatever you're directing it towards. So the LFO isn't actually the thing that's making the sound. Like the filter is making the sound. We're just telling the LFO change the filter, right? So another piece of LFO function is that there are different shapes of LFOs, right? In this example so far, we've kind of had this like pretty even up and down. This is called like a sine wave LFO. So the sound is whatever we're modulating is going to go up and then it's going to come back down. So in this case, the frequency of the cutoff is going to rise and it's going to fall. Okay, so now if I go over to this, you see these LFO waveforms. If I change this shape, you notice that the sound of the LFO, I'm going to make it more intense just so it's more obvious. Now we have this different thing happening where like there's kind of this sharper change. And what's happening is now the modulation, instead of kind of like evenly going up and down like this, it's going to go from one frequency exactly to another one, then back, then back, then back, then back. So it's kind of more sharper because we're going, from an exact amount of something to a different amount of something. It's just a way sharper shift. So if I turn the frequency up so it happens quickly, and then turn the cutoff down, it's pretty cool because then, again, it's just a different flavor. We're still modulating the thing. It's just modulating it in a different way. That's the interesting thing about LFOs and envelopes is that, it's a specific type, and we'll get into envelopes in a later video, but it's a specific type of automation. It's a specific type of like changing a parameter so that I don't have to do it with my hands. And by changing the shape, by changing the frequency, by changing the amount, we actually have a lot of control as to like what that change sounds like, right? So shape is a really interesting one to play with. I like square LFOs because they allow me to like play rhythmically. Right, so there's just a different flavor of movement. Like if I go back to the sine wave, you can tell what's different. Right, so just different characters. As I move through the shapes, you've got kind of like a saw type shape. Essentially, what a saw shape is going to do is it's kind of a mix of those two previous ones, right? You're going to have some sort of, I think in this, you can tell on this specific saw shape that there's like a sharp opening and then it kind of dies down. I'll slow it down so you can hear it. So it's like instantly rising to the top, slowly dying down, right? So that doesn't have the sharp ups and downs both ways that the square does, but it doesn't have the even ups and downs that the sine wave does, right? Triangle shapes are pretty similar to my ears as the sine waves. They're like, it's like a little sharper of an up, but it's still pretty like even up and down. You can tell if I A-B them, if I switch between them, here's a sine wave. Here's a triangle. Pretty close, right? The weird one for me, and I love using this, is there's always, not always, but usually in LFOs and Soundpaints, there's a random shape. So what this is going to do is it's essentially going to, depending on what we have the amount set to, which is here, it's going to open up the cutoff or close the cutoff by like just random amounts. And it's going to be very even and kind of choppy, right? Yeah, it's kind of like, it's like opening each voice at like a different amount. And as you move quicker, if I turn the frequency up, if I turn the amount down, essentially it gives it this kind of like alive, like almost like bubbly So the random thing, you know, again, it's just for this like interesting, okay, what if I want to change the cutoff, but I don't want to change it predictably? Again, in LFO territory, we're just having a lot of options for how to automate the cutoff knob in the specific scenario. They all have different characters. They all have different like, directions that they're turning. Again, just to simplify it, I like to think of it as, you know, if we are turning the cutoff knob, it's like you're telling whoever's turning it, like, all right, here's how fast we're turning it, here's how much we're turning it, and here's the direction that it's going. You know, like here's the nuances regarding how it's getting to each number. So there's a lot of power there. The last thing that can be really interesting to mess with LFOs, I'm going to go back to a sine wave for this one, is the ability to change them with aftertouch. So what aftertouch is, if you don't know, is a lot of keyboards, not all of them, but a lot of them have a way of essentially like playing the note and then pressing it as like an additional modulator. So it's like I play the note and then I press it harder and something else happens. So I'm going to turn the LFO for this off for now. I'm going to turn aftertouch on, mod touch up. I think I have to have the LFO up. You have to have the LFO up. Okay, so here I'm going to have mod touch all the way up. I have my LFO mount. If I play a note kind of gently, notice how you don't hear any of the LFO, right? It's actually pretty interesting because I have the LFO almost all the way up. I have 100%, 99%, but you're not hearing it. And the reason why that is now we've enabled aftertouch to be the thing that triggers the LFO. So the LFO is kind of like set, you know, we have our frequency we like, we have the amount we like, but now in order to activate it, I have to press into the key. So if I play a chord softly and then press it harder, it lets you just activate it kind of like, it's not permanently on. You're activating it whenever you want. And this can lead to some cool, like, again, rhythmic kind of playing. It's a little bit of like a technique practice too, because there are degrees of which, like if I press in like as slow as I can, you know, so there's like a little space where it's like kind of open, more open, right? So it's definitely something to practice. The way that I like to use that the most is by kind of having it be more subtle. Like I'll pick a sound like a kind of paddy organ, something that's pretty subtle. And that's even going to be too much. I'm going to like turn the LFO amount down. There I'm at like 18%. Set the frequency a little higher. So there, now, you know, I have something where I can play and I can add like a little subtle LFO filter movement. So that's something to play with. But again, these are just different ways of, if you notice, like all of this is geared towards automating motion. Like we're changing the cutoff frequency. We're going back and forth. And we're having ways of triggering it that don't involve like manually, you know, using your mouse to like click on the thing and movement, or having to use like a hand in a non-playing way, right? Biggest things to remember are you have how much are we changing, how fast are we changing, and what shape are we changing it in, right? And sine and triangle, pretty close. Square is the even up and down between two parameters. Sawtooth is going to be like an even on one end and then sliding down on the other one. And then random is totally random. And they all have their uses. They all have different musical things. And I just urge you to experiment with them. Also experiment with the sync function. If you're trying to do something in tempo, that can be like a really powerful weapon. So hopefully that made sense to y'all, and I'll catch you for the next video. Cheers, y'all.